I thought what I should do is to go through some groundings that are at the basis of our discussion, and to acknowledge that just the power of the discussion so far, for which I want to thank all of you, and also just to repeat that I think we are at a major turning point, and the forums and the platforms that we are creating for these kinds of discussions are really what we should be doing. Because it's in these discussions that we come up with the ways through the problems and the dilemmas. And we learn every single time. And also to learn across colonialisms, to be with each other from these different parts of the world, through the different languages that we speak, through the different historical experiences that we have, of hard and soft colonialism, of violence and liberalism, of settler colonialism, and of other forms, other ways in which empires took root. And to come up with these answers of how we will arrive at different ways of working. Because we are not looking at a promised land on some horizon that we must get to. Rather, what we are talking about are ways of working. So we are at a major moment in which we are going through a very long experience of rethinking what we mean by museum. This is something that I like to begin with, of how Tony Bennett's notion of the modern museum as a museum of governmentality, which is also a museum of containment, is giving way to a very different use of the idea of museum, which 15 years ago ICOM thought was opportunistic, but which gradually, as ICOM itself became a forum for this contestation, had to begin embracing the idea of a museum as a domain of social mobilization and of enablement rather than disenablement. We are seeing a new kind of museum emerging that is turning its back on the disciplinary nature of the modern museum, of how museums came into the world to confirm certain notions of civilization and to construct certain notions of backwardness. And we need to ask whether the museums that we want, the mobilizing museum, the museum of consultation, the museum of discussion, is indeed a post-disciplinary museum, where in English, when we use post without a hyphen, it means something very specific. I don't know if it is the same for Netherlands, but our German colleagues do not have these distinctions because they only use the hyphen in their construction of what they think of as post-colonial. So post-disciplinary means complicating disciplines, and it means a critique of disciplines rather than imagining them out of existence. We are talking about moving away from the older museum that we continue to inhabit, of a museum concerned with ordered citizenship, rather in thinking about a museum as a space of active citizenship, of civic enunciation and social criticism. And rather than the museum being a collection or a building, an architecture, or physical structure, or an exhibition, when we use the term museum, we rather refer to the consultative processes. We refer to the social processes. So I think in the background, that transition, that struggle, that contestation is there. It is present in our conversations and in our discussions. And in those struggles, we are talking about really thinking about all these disciplinary conventions and the hierarchies and the distinctions that we inhabit, to recognize them in order for us to turn our backs on them, in order for us to have a critical engagement with them. And as you know, one of the fundamental distinctions that came into existence with that 19th century museum was this fundamental distinction between cultural history and what we now in English call the ethnographic. But let me tell you that sometimes our notion of the ethnographic, our English concept of the ethnographic, operates as an alibi, operates as a kind of way of concealing a different kind of colonial museum, which is the space of Volkenkunde, the space of Ethnologie in German, in which our German colleagues translate these concepts into the idea of the ethnographic. And as people know, one of the arguments that I have been making for years is about the continued value about the ethnographic. And how does one move beyond the ethnographic? And there are other distinctions that sit alongside that. The distinction between fine art on the one hand and craft on the other. The ways in which our German colleagues continuously refer to the ethnological museums that they've inherited or that they have even recently remade as the non-European museum. They've used that term so freely in making a distinction between the European and the non-European. And I've always argued, as you know, that the Humboldt Forum preeminently was a museum about making Germany European, fundamentally. And this is a discussion about colonialism, because as we will see, one of the fundamental ways that colonialism lives with us, endures, and continues to exist is in the architecture of our knowledge, is in the epistemologies of our thinking and of the disciplinary nature of the institutions that we inhabit. That is the primary location of the violence of colonialism. And the other way in which a type of colonialism continues to exist is in the disempowering ways in which expertise continues to be claimed. And we are also learning just so much about how care, as we heard today, has a very violent history, often in histories of collecting, in which a certain kind of alibi has come to exist, through which violence has given way to the ethnographic, or the ethnological, more properly named. And one of the terms that I'm going to put in front of us that we need to think about very seriously is the idea of ethnographization. Because some of the presentations this morning almost jumped over that process that occurred, as if what they call objects existed in and of themselves as ethnographic and were merely assembled, and that they'd already began their lives as ethnographic. Well, I'm going to put to you that there were two processes that occurred. They were objectified, and we had some discussion of those museum processes that occurred, the professional processes, and they were ethnographized. Another important grounding that we need to go over, something that surprised me every time I moved into different parts of Europe, went to colleagues at Tervuren, went to Berlin, and made certain kinds of assumptions of where colonialism was and what colonialism was. And it became very clear to me that what people thought of as the ethnological or the ethnographic when they were speaking English were what they thought to be as the non-European. That the ethnological was almost as if it was indigenous, that they were, in their museums, they were caring for material culture that pertained to indigenous pasts or to indigenous societies, rather than them understanding how colonial their structures were. And I want to call this a form of colonial denialism that was there, in which colonialism was understood as a time. And some of you will have seen that very powerful exhibition at the German Historical Museum in 2016, I think it was, about German colonialism, but which placed that colonialism safely in the past. And the other distinction that people made is that when you talk about African societies, when you think of them as colonial, you are talking about how they became contaminated by Europeans. An idea that somehow the colonial belonged to the field of history, whereas African people were the ethnographic people and were marked by an essence. Now, in order to go to the arguments that I need to get to, I also need to cover some other ground that works with another part of how I was formed as a scholar of museums. And that is the encounters that I have had from time to time, particularly in Latin America, with a notion of museum that is not about collections. This is the non-collecting museum. And they exist in different ways. They even have taken shape as a movement. They have an organization that has existed for decades called MINOM, which is concerned with new museologies. And one of the latest committees in ICOM is a committee on social museology that is drawn from the pressure from these kinds of museums. And they've different kinds of museums. There are memorial museums, there are social history museums, community museums, eco-museums. They describe themselves as doing social museology. And sometimes you've got to wonder whether this, because I want to suggest that all of these movements, all of these approaches to museum, the kinds of museums that you've seen develop in favelas in Rio de Janeiro, that have developed on the banks of the Amazon River, that have developed in different parts of Latin America, that these constitute forms of museum as social movement. Museum that is about collecting people. Museums that are about social questions. Museums that are about addressing social dilemmas. And so the only time I've come across a museum association that addresses those kinds of questions was the case of the Brazilian Museums Association, IBRAM, which had a department of social museology, in which whenever there was a social problem in a favela, or a drug problem, or a problem of gangsterism, they went in with the museum as a means of providing a solution, as a means of bringing people together. But is this naming of these kinds of projects, museum, not also a way of bringing governmentality in through the back door? That is a question that we need to bear. It's a never-present question, but we need to embrace the politics of these possibilities. And I'm going to suggest to you that what they offer to us is a means of complicating and questioning authority. And secondly, they offer us a way in which to complicate expertise. And of course, I cut my teeth on these questions at the District 6 Museum in Cape Town, where I did not participate there as a scholar. I learned from the activists. I was the youngest among them. I was the youngest out of the civic movement in the 1980s that created the District 6 Museum. And out of all of those comrades, I was able to be there among the longest before we legislated ourselves out of existence so that the museum professionalized and became governed as a much more professional space. But the District 6 Museum, I've always suggested, has offered us one of the powerful examples of a non-collecting museum. A museum as a space of social gathering rather than caring for the object. A museum that some people have thought of as memorial museum. Some people have thought of as community museum, but community museum not in any sense of kind of cuddly, small-scale, uncomplicated, kind of simplified space, but community in a very strategic sense of choosing politically to define the community outside of the categories of apartheid, to offer the space of enunciation and debate, that offers a space of a critical citizenship, of inscribing yourself into the space and not being told who you are, of it being a contested space of public scholarship. And as some of you will know who have read the work that I've done on this, this museum offered a way of complicating the claims of academic scholarship, because it showed that expertise did not only reside in the academy. In fact, it reversed the relations of expertise very often, even with one of the most difficult disciplines to complicate that expertise, archaeology. Because archaeologists are scholars who hold on to the power of their own interpretation, which they never give up to something that can be called a museum. The public institution par excellence of the archaeologist is the interpretation center, where the archaeologist holds on to authority, rather than being open to that authority being contested. And archaeologists often use the idea of science in order to wield that power. And the argument that I've made, and my colleagues have made, is about the District 6 and other kinds of museums like that in South Africa that present these independent spaces of knowledge formation, independent but not unconnected, independent but not without a relationship with the state, but that this is not a space where the academics who are concerned with the recovery of underclass histories are the ones who come to present those underclass histories in a kind of interpretive space. So, in some ways, the District 6 Museum can be thought of as this space, as this kind of project of social museology, what we have referred to as a museum, not as object, not as building, not as exhibition, but as social process. And the methodologies that have been developed in the District 6 Museum have just amazed me from year to year of how increasingly, and today very definitively, the professional staff, the different curators, the different managers of different departments in that professionalized structure continue to work with communities of people who had been removed and who are involved in a never-ending process of land restitution, making the claim that land restitution is not a question of property, but it's a question of land as landscape. So what I have wanted to do was to suggest that we need to bring these ideas together. We need to think about what it is that social museology, as a kind of activist way of making and of engaging, of negotiating museums and museologies. What can that activist museology offer to those of us who are grappling with what to do with these colonial legacies? Because now we understand that colonialism is not in the past, that colonialism has been enduring, that it lives with us. It continues to live with us in the collecting legacies, in the disciplinary structures that we inhabit, of the professional ways in which we work, of the ways we have been taught in the universities, in the very disciplines that we inhabit. But we have learned how much the ethnological museum is a colonial museum genre. And it's not the same all over the place. It is definitely not the same. Because in the Americas, the ethnographic makes, I would like to argue, an anti-colonial argument on the side of the oppressed and exploited people. I've seen that with colleagues in Mexico. I have seen that. On the African continent, however, I want to make an argument to you that the ethnographic museum is part of the colonial infrastructure. It is part of the institutional matrix of the remnants of a colonial order. And we have all of these extremely tired ethnographic museums, often made in colonial times, that African people do not relate to. in the undoing of the settler colonialism and the apartheid nature of South Africa, it became very clear that you cannot hold on to that distinction between cultural history and the ethnographic. That was just not possible in a democratizing society. And it is also very interesting how that was not possible any longer in a certain kind of recognition of what New Zealand had become as a society. And Te Papa was the space in which that struggle was engaged with. And as you know, in South Africa, the struggle is never over. But at the National Museum, Iziko, in South Africa, that hierarchy and classificatory distinction was done away with. But what does it mean when you curate ceramics previously contained in cultural history and previously contained in the ethnographic? How do you put them together into the same collecting division? We've also learned how much we inhabit a disciplinary and an institutional matrix that was not always there in that way. So it's become very clear that in the work of Rückgabe that our German colleagues do, they make an automatic assumption that the ethnological is a caring museum form, whereas they now accept that the presence of what they call human remains in their museums is a violent legacy. They understand that. And between 2015 and about 2018 or 2019, they went through a process of accepting that the museum is not an appropriate place for the remains of dead people. They continued to think, however, that the work of attending to the dead of colonialism, the dead of the genocide in Namibia, the dead of the genocide in former Tanganyika, was the work of human biology. They kept on thinking that that was the work that needed to be done. And even though often the ethnological and the anthropological had the same history, in which the very same scholars collected skulls as they made sound recordings and as they collected what they call material culture. The Rückgabe inquiry about the dead is a separate inquiry from colonial provenance research on material culture. They have been kept separate. And so the 1,000 skulls assembled by Tchaikovsky will be returned to Rwanda. But not a single question has arisen about the sound recordings he made at the same time, about the objects that he collected at the same time. And so what I want to say here is that we need to be wary of operating inside of our classificatory system. And it is a very interesting thing for us to think about. To think about Wêreldmuseum, Museum of World Cultures. Is this just an updating of the language that we use? We have a new center in our university that is concerned with linguistics and multilingualism and diversity. And I often tell them that's just an updating of ethnolinguistics, that you haven't thought methodologically about what your object is. And I want to say, I want to put it there provocatively. that the concept of the World Museum potentially is a post-ethnographic museum. It is a museum not as a post-hyphen ethnographic, but a post-non-hyphen ethnographic. A museum that wants to complicate the ethnographic as a domain of value and to think about other kinds of ways of thinking about society. And it is an opportunity for us to really think about what co-curatorship could mean. Because co-curatorship sometimes, as it has been written about by some of our colleagues, was a form of not just collaboration, but of co-optation into the museum's narrative. But it does hold the possibility for a much more complicated and negotiated process of knowledge formation, something that holds potential for the unsettlement of expertise. And I've already made this point to you about the post-ethnographic without the hyphen, about how we must live in a complicated way with what the ethnographic has given us. I think it's very safe to say, and it's written all over the policies that are coming out of this society, of the inquiries that you are making, about how we now potentially we find ourselves facing the colonial at a time after colonial denialism, of admitting to the violence of colonialism, of admitting to the afterlives of colonialism, of worrying about what it does to us, what the blood of the past does to the blood in the present, and what one does when one lives with blood. When you do that kind of recognition, there is an opportunity for us to develop new methodologies. And we have been talking about those in the discussions that we've had today. About the consultative work that is not about the co-optation into an unchanged disciplinary system of the museum, but that wants to complicate and wants to challenge the very concept of museum that we have worked with. And I want to put to you the idea that we are living in a time in which restitution is the new museology. That restitution is not an event of return. In fact, we should abandon the idea of restitution as a singular concept, and we should rather turn it into something that we do. That this is an opportunity to do restitutionary work. That the work that we do, the consultations that we do, the exhibitions that we plan, should be part of a restitutionary program that is simultaneously concerned with reparation, not just as payment, but without saying that payment is not on the table, but that is about social repair. That this is a time of doing the work of repair, of doing reparatory work. This is a time of restitution and reparation as work that has to be done. And the histories of the violent histories that we have inherited make it incumbent upon us to embrace these frameworks. And how do we do that? Well, first we must worry about that almost neo-colonial concept that came to us from the museology of the Pacific. It was almost like a museology that was not made by anti-colonial movements, by freedom that was not made by liberation movements. And I want to say that we need to worry about how we have exported these ideas into other parts of the world, that whenever we are called upon to think about the legacies of the ethnographic, the reader's reports will require you to talk about it as entanglement. And what a politics of entanglement does, we need to worry about that. And I want to say to you that we are at a time of the potential for a new radical museology based on the idea of restitution as work that needs to be done, of restitutionary work. We are in an age of restitution. And the first thing that we need to learn, it's very interesting for me to listen to the ways in which these issues were discussed today. The first thing that we need to learn is that repatriation is not restitution. Yesterday, I spoke to colleagues at the VU University about how in Nederland, our colleagues here need to stop talking about teruggawe as a term that has been adopted from the German term Rückgabe. Because this is not about a giving. This is not about doing the logistical, the legal, and the political and the diplomatic work of arranging a return. Will it be in a box? Will it be on a ship? Or will it be on a plane? And do we need a law? Yes, we need a law. Will it be a policy? We need to think about terugbesorging and how sorg gives you a way of rethinking restitution. Now, of course, our colleagues in the Americas have a different challenge of sovereignty, of asserting sovereignty. So we understand why our colleagues there talk about repatriation. And when NAGPRA, early NAGPRA came, and later NAGPRA also came, it gave those institutions the onus to do the work to determine what needs to be returned. The onus was put on collecting institutions not to wait for claimants to come forward. But inadvertently, what we said was that a return is a giving. And instead, we need to be building restitution movements so that restitution is not just understood as being grateful at an airport, waiting for the plane to land in a magnanimous cleansing of the blood of European hands. Because this is a moment of African sovereignty. This is a moment of attending to the unfinished work of sovereignty. Not just the sovereignty of the nation state, but a sovereignty across national borders and a sovereignty in local communities. The work of restitution is precisely to undertake these investigations, to undertake these complicated discussions with the nation and with the local. And if we think about what that work will mean, everyone kept on talking about the object. everyone kept on talking about human remains. Human remains is a term of museum governance. It is a concept of human biology. When you make a decision to return the dead, and you place them, as we have in Cape Town, into the space of being de-accessioned, of having been taken out of the book, Ontboek. This is a moment of changing our language. These are ancestors. They are not objects. We have to go through a process of de-objectification, de-ethnographization, indeed of demuseumization. And the question, I mean, it was so clear. Who speaks for the dead in the returns of the dead that we have been doing in Germany? Human biologists do not speak of the dead. Here was an opportunity for the diasporic communities, as they did at the beginning with the Namibian dead, to speak for the dead of the genocide. This is not a work of museum governance. It is a work of mourning. The museum has to be a space of mourning. So this is a new way of thinking about restitution and reparatory work. And that this needs to happen precisely in these in-between spaces of those conversations, those discussions, those negotiations, that recognizes the importance of activism that can only take place alongside expertise. This is a moment to question authority, to question authorization, and to rethink authorship. This is a time to reimagine a museum, not as a collection, but indeed a museum as a process. Thank you very much.